just having a conversation, bunch of guys enjoying some non-alcoholic beers, coming together and
Yeah.
talking about life. Um, so first off, if you could, just for everyone, introduce yourself, kind of go through your spiel a little bit, how you got to the NA scene, where you're at now, in terms of the NA scene, as well as, I guess, geographically too. Yeah, we'll start with that.
Okay. Yeah, sure. My name is Jonny Daylett, and I'm a husband, father, and I happen to brew beer. Um, I live in Dallas, Texas, or at least the suburbs of Dallas. And I've lived in this area for probably about 12 years now. And I've been brewing for about 8 to 9 years. Um, Started home brewing and quickly got into the professional career of brewing. I even went to American Brewers Guild, which is basically like brewing school. There's some online distance learning, and then there's some on-site learning, experiential learning. Did a lot of internships with local breweries, and spent 4 years brewing professionally. I stopped brewing and stopped drinking alcohol a couple years ago, just for mental health and other personal reasons. And I wanted to focus more on family. And we had just had our first child, our daughter, and just really wanted to focus on that. And so I dropped alcohol. I was completely dry for about a year and a half. No NA beer, anything. Mostly because I didn't know about the good NA beer that's coming out now.
Yeah, the good beer. There's been
The
some
good, yeah,
not
good
great
is the key
beers,
word.
and
Right.
now it's getting some traction. So
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, been drinking NA beer for the last year, and it really took off when I tried athletic brewing. That's the one that really sunk in
yeah.
and impressed me, and kind of inspired me to get back into brewing because it's something I miss.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really awesome culture.
Which athletic beer was the one that got? I mean, I know they're all really good, but
Yeah,
which one was that one? Was it the IPA or the stout or the IPA?
Run Wild
Yeah,
IPA. Yep, that's still my favorite NA beer. It can't be topped yet.
yeah. That's definitely up there for me. I think I have like 8 in my refrigerator behind me. uh, awesome. So just kind of the first question, jumping directly in.
Yeah.
What's kind of the difference between what's some differences between brewing alcoholic versus non-alcoholic uh, beers, and have you found the process more challenging, or in a good way, more challenging in a not as positive way? So if you can talk a little bit about that, that'd be awesome.
Sure. So, just full disclosure, I'm probably not the biggest expert on NA brewing,
No, not at
non-alcoholic
all.
brewing.
That's the
But
beauty of it.
More than us, you know more than us.
okay, yeah. But the main difference is, of course, with traditional brewing, you keep the alcohol that the yeast produces. The yeast chews up the fermentable sugars, turns it into alcohol and CO2, and you have beer. But with non-alcoholic brewing, there are a few different methods that different breweries utilize. Um, you either brew a beer without the alcohol, or you brew a normal beer and remove the alcohol. So on the first one is like you get a very small grain bill. You would use like 90% less grain than you would in a normal brew. So the mash is a lot smaller. That way you have less fermentables for the yeast to eat. And you want to use more specialty malts and something like that, because if you just use, base malts and a few crystal malts and stuff like that, like you would for a normal pale ale,
Mm-hmm.
you end up with a very bland, flavorless, bodiless beer. So, like something like a BrewDog's Nanny State, they do this. They use a very small grain bill. They use a lot of specialty malts, and they end up with a 0.5% ABV beer. Now, on the other end is removing alcohol, and that's a little. There's two different ways to do that. You can either burn off the alcohol, like evaporate it. You produce your beer like normal, then you cook the beer at about 172 degrees Fahrenheit, and it evaporates the alcohol while leaving most of the beer behind. And I say most because you still evaporate some of the volatile compounds, like some of the lighter hop aromas, and you get some more melanoidins and stuff like that. So it changes the character of the beer. Some would say that it for the worse. And that's probably the oldest method, I would say, of making non-alcoholic beer. And then there's the very expensive way that a lot of the macro breweries use is reverse osmosis filtration, which at the molecular level strips the alcohol from the beer. So it separates alcohol from all your flavors and water. So you're just left with non-alcoholic beer, de-alcoholized beer.
And that's what they kind of do with wines, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, for the most part, I think that's what they do with wine. I'm not big on NA wine, but
Yeah.
I know Tyler is.
Depends on the wine. Has to be sparkling for me.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as far as like challenging processes, I mean, I think the biggest challenge is just deciding which route you're going to go down. Because if you're doing brewing on a bigger scale, once you've kind of decided how you're going to do it, you're pretty much committed to that path, especially if you're going to get something as capital heavy as reverse osmosis filtration. So yeah, on a homebrew scale, you can experiment like I have with my first batch.
Is that what you're drinking now?
No.
Oh, that'd been cool.
Yeah, but this is it back here. I wasn't super pleased with it because it was my first go at it, brewing a non-alcoholic beer at home. And since I haven't been in the game for a while, I don't have all of my equipment that I used to have. So I'm very bare bones trying to make something happen that I've never done exactly like this before.
Could you maybe walk us through that process? Kind of like what you did wrong, like what you learned from it, that type of.
And also, what kind of beer is it?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
That's my burning question: is what kind of beer is it?
Well, it was supposed to be a pale ale. Very simple, straightforward, kind of like Sierra Nevada pale ale style. So I tried something new that a lot of us in the NA Homebrewer Facebook group we've been talking about, called cold mash. And I should have just done something really simple like a Nanny State clone or something, but I think I'm better than I am, whatever. Yeah. So I tried this new experimental thing called cold mash and ended up basically, instead of having a hot mash where you hold your grains in hot water for about an hour or two, cold mash is you steep the grains in cold water overnight. And the point is to extract flavors and large chain carbohydrates instead of the small fermentables that yeast like to eat, so that you have a less fermentable beer, but you still have a lot of the flavor of the malt.
And for this beer, did you use less grain then as well? Like you explained earlier?
I used a pretty normal amount for a 5-gallon batch. With a cold mash, you can use the same amount to get that same flavor profile you want. I think the problem there was I got more conversion than I expected, and so it ended up fermenting out a lot more than I expected. So I had to go back after it fermented and add water back to water it down to get the ABV below 0.5%. And so, you know, that's never a good thing when you have to water down your beer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was that original ABV?
It ended up, let's see, it wasn't crazy. It was like 1.6% ABV. So it's still, I mean, it kind of worked, but I would have to do a lot of tweaks to it. And like I said, I could do something way simpler and probably get a better product in the end. So next time, I'm probably just going to do the reduced grain bill and just keep it simple.
And when you reduce the grain, do you have to add something else to still give it more flavor? So I'm just trying to think. So once you reduce the grain, like I feel like that removes obviously flavors. So like I feel like you have to replace it with something, or you don't. It's just a less tasteful beer. So there's something that you have to add extra to it then?
That's where the specialty malts come in.
Okay, that's what. Okay.
Yeah, so like instead of having like a mostly base malt with like a small percentage of specialty malts, you're having like 20% caramel malt and 30% amber malt and 15% roasted malt. So you have a lot of flavorful malts, and very like the amount of base malt you put in there is very small. So the base malt is like a pale 2-row barley malt. It's very fermentable. It has a lot of protein enzymes and sugars that break down in the mash, and the yeast really like. So with specialty malts, they don't have as many enzymes. They don't break down as easily. And so you're left with the bigger chain molecules that the yeast don't want to eat. And so those get left behind and allow the beer to be more flavorful. Plus, you can always throw in just a ton of hops, and
when in doubt, just hop it.
Yeah.
What would how many gallons or liters would one batch yield?
So on my scale that I'm doing right now, just to test stuff out, I'm just doing like 5 gallons at a time. So that's usually the standard for home brewing. Some do up to 10 or 15 gallons, but for my purposes, I only need about 5 gallons.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have so much to learn about brewing. I know absolutely nothing.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating, really, isn't it?
I could talk about it all day.
You're saying words that individually I understand what they mean, but when you
But
string
when they
them
come
together like that,
yeah, forget about
Right.
it.
wait, what?
Yeah, sorry if I get too scientific.
No, I'm
not at
enjoying it.
all.
I've been drinking beer and alcohol since I was 21 for legal reasons. I'll say that. And I just a couple months ago got into the whole NA scene, so I am by far a complete newbie in this whole entire thing. So I'm just kind of sitting back and letting the experts talk about everything, and it's really great to listen to and learn about. So
Cool.
Yeah.
In general, Johnny, have you seen, since when you began as to now in 2020, what changes have you seen in brewing, or have you seen with regard to technology? And is there much difference, or?
Yeah. I mean, it hasn't changed a whole lot. I mean, there's definitely better equipment now. There's better filtration. You can really pinpoint how hazy you want your beer. Like if you want a hazy beer, or if you just want a slightly hazy beer, if you want a crystal clear beer, you can filter it out. It tastes exactly the same. That's something that's used to, you had to pay exorbitant amounts of money to be able to do that. Now small microbreweries can do that. Other than that, there are some really new technology coming out, especially for breweries that are getting into making hard seltzer. There's equipment that separates the alcohol. It's basically the reverse osmosis filtration, but on a smaller scale. Separates out the alcohol. You add carbonated water, and you have hard seltzer on one end, and what you have left on the other end is non-alcohol. beer. So there is definitely an avenue to be pursued here. It's something that I've talked to a few like breweries and also hard seltzer producers about, and they're like, yeah, that's really interesting, but we just haven't, pulled the trigger on it or something like that. And it's definitely something that I'm interested in. Not that I have any money to, go towards that, but
We all just need our own venture capitalist.
Right.
Wouldn't that be nice?
But yeah.
So it separates the NA beer, and then the other byproduct you have is essentially unflavored hard seltzer. Is that?
Yeah, like you just get like straight alcohol on one side. All you got to do is add carbonated water to it, and you end up with a hard seltzer. Add your flavors, whatever you want to do. It's really neat. It's like a feat of engineering that's, pretty amazing.
There's $1 million in there somewhere. I just need to figure out where exactly it is.
Right. Yeah.
And in general, when you started out brewing, was there like a stigma, say, towards non-alcoholic beer, or?
Yeah. I mean, there's a bit of a stigma still, especially like in the craft brewing circles that I used to be a part of. We never really talked about it. It was always just kind of the elephant in the room,
the redheaded stepchild.
Yeah, it's just something in the corner that no one really, just don't look at that. Just
Absolutely.
don't worry about it.
It's not that. It's over there. Just ignore it.
Yeah. But I don't think a lot of the brewers who are making alcoholic beer are even aware. Maybe now they are, but back when I was brewing professionally, they definitely weren't aware of any up and coming, craft non-alcoholic beer. It was more just like, oh yeah, there's O'Doul's, there's Beck's, there's the macro lagers.
Those are the only ones I knew about up until about 4 months ago.
Yeah. But I think as soon as you introduce someone who just staunchly says NA beer is not real beer, and you introduce them to an, athletic IPA, you can do like a blind taste test, just put a koozie on the can so that, here's a beer.
That's actually exactly what I did last summer to someone. We were talking about it, and they were dumping all over it, and I put an athletic IPA in a koozie, and I said, here, try this. And they said, oh, this is really good. What is it? And I go, it's that non-alcoholic beer you were giving me crap for about 3 hours ago.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So it's like, I don't know. There's a lot to unpack there. There's, the flavor has just increased exponentially over the past couple of years, as far as NA beverages in general. I'm not really sure where it came from or why all of a sudden it seems like it's just, skyrocketed. But yeah, it's definitely something that still has a stigma, but it's easing up a bit, at least in brewing circles.
That's good.
Yeah.
So you mentioned brewing professionally a couple minutes ago. Were you brewing for a brewery, like the head brewer, or just kind of going to fairs with homebrew and winning all of the awards? Can you talk a little bit about your brewing past? You don't have to name names or anything of breweries that you have internally blacklisted or anything, but if you can just elaborate a little more.
You can if you want.
I mean, you can, but you don't feel pressure to.
Juicy content.
Yeah. Well, one of them that I was a head brewer for doesn't exist anymore, so I mean, it's whatever. Yeah, I still have friends who are all, that were part of that, and they've moved on to other breweries and stuff. Yeah, for a couple years, I was a head brewer at a brewery here near Dallas, and it was a production brewery. We packaged, cans, kegs, bottles, mostly like local distribution, some, Central and South Texas. But yeah, so that was a really good learning experience for me, because I basically, before that, I was just interning and volunteering a lot at local breweries. Mm-hmm. I would call in sick at my normal job and then just go volunteer at one of the breweries and just, put in my work there, basically, getting paid to go make beer. I don't work for that anymore, so I can say that. Yeah. And then after that, I worked at a brew pub in Dallas, and that let me do a lot more experimental stuff because it was a much smaller scale. It was only like a 3-barrel system, mm-hmm. Which is a little rusty. I think that's like 90 gallons or something like that, 90 to 100 gallons at a time. So I got to play around with making all kinds of crazy stuff. Like our number one beer was a jalapeno saison. That was our best-selling beer.
Wow.
So I definitely have a mostly local, experience here in North Texas. But I've gotten some volunteering experience all over. I did, like I said, the American Brewers Guild. They have on-site training in Vermont. They have their own little brew house there, like a 15-barrel brew house. And you get to get some hands-on training, as well as a lot of chemistry and engineering, math, homework, which is a headache, but it served me well.
Was that jalapeno saison one of the more like crazy exotic beers you've ever done? What are some flavor?
Yeah.
What are some flavor stories that you've messed around with?
Yeah, the good and the bad.
Yeah.
I got bored of the jalapeno saison, honestly. We had to crank that one out. So, but some of the weirder ones, there was one I made a sati, which is basically it's like a Nordic ale, brewed with juniper branches. So in the mash, you put juniper branches in there to kind of strain the wort through. And you can also throw in juniper berries just for added flavor and aroma. It smells amazing when you're brewing it. It smells like Thanksgiving. I don't know. It's weird. And then we threw lingonberry into the fermentation. So it had that extra, like kind of a Swedish flavor to it. And then we used a farmhouse yeast. So it had some, like funky bacteria flavors. And it was a blend of like bacteria and yeast. And that ended up being like one of my favorite beers that I've ever brewed. Just because, it sounds crazy. Like it's just going to be a jumble of flavors, but it turned out really well. Just a very interesting farmhouse ale. And those were the kind of things I like to play around with, especially like now that I can try stuff that's non-alcoholic. I can definitely, start experimenting with all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
That was actually one of perfect segue into it is now with those like weird flavors that you've done, what's the next thing that you want to tackle with your homebrew? What's the next batch gonna be?
Kind of a throwback to my early homebrewing days. My second batch was a India red ale, so like a really, really hoppy red ale, American red ale. So I'm kind of getting a little bit of that nanny state and a little bit of my own like personal preferences in beer, because hoppy red ale is one of my favorite styles of beer. Just something that's like clean and floral and piney. And so I'm gonna try that next. Just keeping it simple, like I said, and then I'll start getting weirder after I nail down, the processes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That sounds really cool.
Yeah.
And for each beer, so does the malt have to complement it then, in general? So like the special, because I know like malts are pretty important for the most part, but especially even in this process, even more important. So does it have to change depending on the beer you're making then?
Yeah, definitely. I think even more so with non-alcoholic beer,
Yeah.
because you're depending on a lot of that for the flavor profile of what you're making. Um, there's a lot less uh, fermentation flavors. You don't have the flavor of the alcohol or the texture and the body of the alcohol. Um, you don't have as much yeast produced flavors and compounds. Um, so you're depending a lot more on the grain bill and the hops. And yeah, so it's definitely very important depending on what style of beer you're making. That said, one person's idea of a red ale could be completely different from another person's idea of a red ale. And so it's just kind of, I don't know, it comes down to personal preference. Especially whenever you're just brewing for yourself, you can do whatever you want. You can, make a super hoppy red ale that's barely red at all, or you can make a super malty amber ale that's like, dark copper, and they fall into the same category.
And what yeast do you normally use? I know obviously like the yeast ferments it. So like, is there anything special about that? Do you use less yeast so it doesn't ferment so much sugar to turn into than alcohol? Is there something unique with that?
I'd imagine that on a production scale, they'd probably use less yeast, just because it becomes like an economic thing at that point. You want to save money, so you don't need to pitch as much yeast. But on a homebrew scale, you basically just pitch 1 pack of liquid or dry yeast for a 5-gallon batch. Usually, you only really want to do 2 packages if you're doing like a bigger beer, like above 6% ABV. So one pack, just throw it in there, and the yeast kind of takes care of it. But yeah, so the yeast I usually like to use is just American ale yeast, either Y yeast or White Labs. They both produce pretty good, clean fermenting ale yeast. That's what I used on my first batch, but I don't have temperature control on my fermentation right now, so I'm just using ambient house air conditioning to keep it cool. So I think that was another factor in producing a beer that was subpar. I think next time I'm going to use this new type of ale yeast from Norway. It's called a Kveik yeast. I mean, Kveik basically means yeast, but it's a higher temperature fermenting yeast, and it supposedly, just chews through the wort like super fast, and it's super clean. You don't have to worry about temperature fluctuations as much. So it sounds perfect for my purposes. So I'm going to give that a try next time. Just try to, set everything up for success.
And then with the yeast, so is there a way to not let it, keep on eating the sugar and turning into alcohol rather than it just eating the sugar and not producing alcohol at all? Is there anything special with that? Like, is that a thing?
Yeah, there are yeast strains that like a lazy yeast, that really needs very small carbohydrate molecules to convert into alcohol. And there are yeast that are just monsters that'll chew up whatever you throw at them and convert it into, a 15% ABV beer.
Why am I thinking of a pool full of piranhas swimming in beer right now? You throw a chicken bone in and it just spits out
Right.
You throw a whole
Exactly.
chicken carcass in and it spits out just the bones and everything.
Yeah. That's a pretty good analogy. Yeah. But yeah, depending on the style too, you're gonna change the kind of yeast you use. For most American ales, just plain American ale yeast. But if you're doing like a wit beer, you want a very specific Belgian wit beer yeast. If you're doing a saison, you want a saison yeast, etc.
Interesting.
Yeah.
The whole process from start to finish, how long would you be looking at?
Yeah. For the most part, about 2 weeks is pretty standard for an ale. Ales are quicker than lagers. So brew day, 5-6 hours of, start to finish. And then you just wait for 2 weeks max, usually, for an ale. For the non-alcoholic beer, like the small grain bill that I'm doing, fermentation takes place like within 48 hours. And then the rest of the time is just yeast kind of cleaning up after itself.
Is that because it has less stuff? The yeast has less things to eat, basically, and it just goes like that. In a
Exactly.
sense, less sugar.
Right. It's like it's done, and it's like, oh, I guess our job's here is done.
Yeah.
But you still want to give it a little time, like probably another 5 days or so, because during primary fermentation, yeast will produce compounds like diacetyl and things that don't taste very good, like buttery green apple stuff. And you want the yeast to kind of come back and clean it up. They take that stuff back in and produce more like pleasing compounds. So you do that for about a week. Then you can bottle. If you're doing bottle conditioning, you just go straight into bottles with a little bit of corn sugar, and you cap it, leave it room temperature for 1 to 2 weeks, and it carbonates by the yeast. Just has that tiny bit of corn sugar, just enough to produce CO2, but not enough to produce like a meaningful amount of alcohol. And you got to watch out for bottle bombs when you do that. So you got to make sure you put the right amount of sugar in.
Yeah.
If you're doing forced carbonation, you can just go straight into a keg and just pump CO2 into it, and you're ready to go.
So does beer have carbonation when it's in the keg, or is it added when it's coming through the lines?
You can do it multiple ways. Mostly, for the most part, craft breweries will put their finished beer into what's called a bright tank, and that's something where it keeps it cold, and you also you diffuse CO2 into it, and that carbonates the beer, and the beer is done, and you just go straight into a keg. Homebrew, if you have kegs, you'll probably put flat beer into the kegs and then force carbonate the keg itself.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh.
There's
I think
so
there's
much I
any-
still have
hang on.
no idea what's going on.
The differences in there's primary fermentation, secondary. Isn't primary called, like, I believe, the lag phase? There's a lag phase, like a part of the primary fermentation.
The second thing you said.
Okay.
Yeah, there's like a lag. It doesn't like start right away. It's not like a baker's yeast, that just like starts bubbling and rising almost instantly. Brewer's yeast takes probably about 12 hours or so before it really starts kicking in. And that's your lag time. That's the time that it's most susceptible to infection as well. So you got to be careful. Make sure everything's sanitary and clean. And then primary is basically all the production of alcohol, and secondary is kind of a vague term. Brewers argue all the time about whether secondary is even necessary, or if it's just all one fermentation and there isn't really a segregation between a primary and a secondary. But secondary basically means you're letting that's when you're letting the yeast clean up after itself. So it's producing a cleaner, more pleasant beer. If you like got it cold too early, like cut off the fermentation, it would have like just basically off flavors that you don't want. Sometimes that happens with like English ale yeasts are known for producing a lot of diacetyl, the buttery flavor compound. And if you don't give it enough time to kind of clean up after itself and ramp up the temperature, it's going to linger in the finished beer. So that's something you got to you got to keep an eye on and keep checking on almost daily basis.
Gotcha. So the yeast basically stops working in two cases: if there's not enough sugar, or if the temperature isn't right, basically.
Yeah. So the temperature is definitely important. Some yeasts are like some Belgian saison, like saison yeasts are a lot more flexible. They can withstand higher temperature fluctuations. But if you want something really clean tasting, like an American IPA, you don't want any like funky yeast flavors. You have to really nail down your temperature to about 70, 72 degrees Fahrenheit. You don't want it to go much higher than that.
Gotcha. And do some people put yeast in during fermentation?
Yeah. So I think it's almost like a German tradition to do, is to add more yeast during it's called Heikrausen. It's when the first batch of yeast is very active, and you add in more to make sure that it keeps going and doesn't kind of peter out.
It's an adrenaline rush for the yeast.
Yeah, you're basically giving the yeast back up so that it can take care of everything.
Are there certain yeasts that are better for NA beers, you think, than regular alcoholic beers, or can you just kind of use whatever you want?
I don't know yet. I think that's a really good question and something that probably hasn't been researched very much yet. There isn't a lot out there to go off of. Most of the information that I found out about brewing NA beer was from a Facebook group and other people just sharing their own experiences. Yeah. I mean, it's probably very similar to traditional brewing, depending on what kind of flavors you want. If you want to make a wit beer, you got to use a Belgian wit beer yeast. And that's actually one of the brews that I have lined up as a wit beer. I think it'll be perfect for this Texas heat.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome.
It's all so interesting.
There's just a lot to process right now. This is incredible information. There's definitely a lot more. I knew like the basic concepts of brewing, but there's a reason I'm not a brewer, because chemistry and I do not get along well.
Well, it's great to hear from somebody who's done it, rather than say read it in a book or watch a YouTube video about it,
Yeah, definitely.
And is now playing both sides. So I'd love to have you back on in like a couple months or something after you've been able to tweak things a little bit, and
that'd
be awesome.
Did you name your first batch?
Pale Ale number 1.
Oh, excellent.
I don't name it until I like it.
That's
fair enough. It creates a sense of attachment that we just don't need right now. We don't need that attachment with the failures. Ian, Tyler, do you have any final questions? I was kind of watching us go down the list over here, but do you guys have any other questions that you want to throw out, or Johnny, do you have anything else that you want to add for what you're doing and everything?
I think it's awesome what you guys are doing. I think definitely the industry needs something like this to kind of grow the awareness of the rise in good NA beer, and I'm very excited to see where it all goes from here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, we are too. We definitely are.
Where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, Instagram as J Daylett. So it's my first initial last name. It's easy.
Awesome. We'll definitely put that information in the descriptions and all that stuff so people can find you and
cool.
All that goodness.
Thanks. Good chatting with you.
All right. Have a good one.
Have a good one.
And best of luck with the brews.
Yeah.
Thank you. I need it.
Thanks, Johnny.
All right. Bye.